Welcome to my interview of season 1 of Interview with the Vampire, episodes 4 and 5. The ruthless pursuit of blood with all of a child's demanding, and a vile hunger for your hammering heart. So I mentioned in my review of episode 3 that I have seen all of season 1 at this point in time, so there's not any surprises or expectations I feel like to set. I'm going to continue to try and divorce the show from the book, especially now that we're finally getting to meet Claudia, and 14-year-old Claudia is quite different than 6-year-old Claudia for obvious reasons. But let's dive into it, starting with a couple of specific scenes I wanted to talk about. I love that in episode 4 we're starting with Claudia's diary. She's got this energy and exuberance that really breathes some life and energy into the show that it desperately needed. I think it's great because it does explain some of the show's what I would consider inconsistencies and how things are being viewed between the first 3 episodes and 4, 5, and 6. We're getting something specifically from Claudia's journal. So some of the things that might have been bothering Louis or plaguing his and Lestat's relationship just might not have been anything she noticed or cared to write about. And I wanted to call out this scene with Lestat, Louis, and Claudia at the coffin maker shop because something similar but different happens in the book. Louis and Claudia do go to the coffin maker's store and tell him that she has a heart condition and they need to get a coffin for her. But in the book, getting this coffin was an incredibly fraught topic where Louis and Claudia had been sharing the coffin up until now. Louis is devastated that Claudia might ever want any separation from him. He's doing this under extreme duress. And later when he finds out that Lestat and Claudia had killed the coffin maker, he's also kind of very disgusted with them. And of course here in the show, all 3 of them are at the store together. Claudia is acting like an exuberant, boisterous child, which tips the human off that something strange is happening. And Louis is just sort of resigned, closing of the curtain so they can kill this dude, steal his coffin, and move on with their lives. It's almost played as a slapstick joke here. And that's not necessarily a complaint, it's just highlighting the 2 differences in these scenes, even though beat for beat, it's more or less the same things happening. And then jumping into episode 5, the scene where Louis goes to see his sister at the graveyard, and she reveals that her and her husband are going up north, they're bankrupt, and that they're leaving him behind. She's got a grave for him, and the man before her now is not her Louis. This is such a sad, heart-wrenching scene because at this point in time, Claudia has left the family, and Louis is already in a severe depression. So to know that both Claudia is gone, possibly forever, and now his sister is leaving him, moving on, really a sorrowful moment. It also mimics a scene in the book that Louis recounts where he was looking at his sister who'd put his headstone up, and she was mourning his loss because she thought he had died in that fire. He was torn because part of him wanted to come out, but he held himself back because at this point in time his sister was an old lady and Louis was still an unchanged youth. He knew that her finding out about his unchanged state and vampirism in general would drive her to madness. In both cases, Louis' vampirism has sort of driven a wedge between him and his family, and it shows that both the book Louis and this TV show counterpart are very family oriented and really need that grounding presence of the family and that caretaker role to sort of thrive and feel good about themselves. And then lastly, the scene where Louis and Lestat are having that drag out fight, and Claudia comes in and she begs Lestat to stop. He wants to get her, he doesn't need to hurt Louis, he should be going after her. And Lestat turns to her and says, "It was never about you." For me, that's such a powerful line because it has a couple layers of context. Within the show, it's kind of neat because we've been reading Claudia's diaries, which have all been told she's the main character and the central protagonist of the story. Now we're refocusing back. This interview with the vampire is with Louis, and it's interesting in the context of the Vampire Chronicles novels because even though we could say that Interview with the Vampire is really all about Claudia and Louis sort of dealing with that loss and accepting that she's never going to come back, the larger context of the Vampire Chronicles themselves, Claudia plays such a small, insignificant, forgettable role. So again, sort of being like, even though you take center stage in all of these productions of Interview with the Vampire, and we're often talking about how like Anne Rice was dealing with this grief and loss of a young child, and Claudia in a lot of ways was a fill-in, the main meat of a lot of the things that are happening in the story are happening around Claudia and not to or about her, like Lestat and Louis' relationship, and Louis trying to kind of find his place in the world. You know, even in the main book, he finds solace and meaning for a minute with Claudia, but eventually that starts to fall apart and unravel for him as well, because you can't really find that in another person. So then moving into characters and relationships. Y'all, Daniel is a jerk. We don't see a lot of him, but I don't like the way he treats people in general in this set of events. I get that Louis thinks he needs Daniel to tell his story, but part of me wonders why he doesn't just straight up go public without like this prop dude in front of him. And like the two of them arguing about Claudia's role in the book, Daniel makes like some good points about how once the story's written, we can't really control the narrative or how people perceive Claudia or what they do with her from there. But I also think some of like his dismissiveness of Louis' feelings about the whole situation is a little bit odd after he spent a moment kind of bonding with Louis over his own two daughters and Louis' daughter who's lost. Feels like the guy has a lot of animosity and antagonistic behavior with no real end goal in sight. And maybe that's just who he is as a person, but it does make me kind of wonder like how he gets these stories and scoops and stuff if he's just like a douchebag all the time. So let's jump right into Claudia and her story. These two episodes are her main arc. What I thought were angels were really hell demons. Everything she knew before has been burned in a fire. She's decided to go along with it and make the best of it. It sort of like sums up her personality for the first episode pretty well. She's a very interesting take on the Claudia character from the book because obviously this aged up version remembers her old life. I can buy that she had a really rough, bad childhood. A few things they tell us, like her mother died in birth, her uncle was abusive to her. She probably didn't get a lot of childhood or good things in life. As it was, she thought like a house in the Rue Royale was potentially heaven. So it makes sense to me that she would sort of like embrace this change. I could see why you might do anything to keep that, and you might not think anything about killing people or have any moral dilemma with it. And I can see like some of her acting younger being like her reliving a childhood that it sounds like she didn't really get to have. I do have a little bit of difficulty with her like being concerned about not being able to live on her own or like not being seen as an adult like moment, because to me like she's acting very childishly and inappropriately in ways that people might assume that she was like touched or mentally ill in some kind of way, and that might be why they're treating her with kid gloves more than her actual appearance. Obviously the actress playing Claudia season 1 is Bailey Bass, and they did what they could to make her look younger, but she's still quite tall. She still has like more mature facial features than you see on children. So it seems to me like she could easily be perceived as an adult if she just aged up her dress and acted more maturely. So when she starts to go onto that arc of like love and lust and self-discovery and like talking about her actual age versus the age of her body, like rang a little hollow to me in this particular incarnation. I think her murdering her first love is a great way to bring her into like a angsty reign of terror, off to find yourself kind of moment. The thing I didn't care for in her arc was really that they used SA as some kind of like aging up device or maturity bestowing device. Like she has a traumatic experience and now she's wise and caring and thoughtful and willing to step back into a role as Louis' sister instead of like being the main character of her own story. Maybe if she had come back and had been looking for protection from the outside world with these vampires, like looking for some kind of shelter, I could see that. Or if we hadn't had that assault scene and maybe she had just realized through following them around and reading these books, she'd come to this conclusion in an organic way that way. Overall, like the scene itself doesn't do a lot for the story, so I feel like we could remove that right out and had exactly the same context. But if we were gonna do like an assault style story, I just wish it had been implemented more thoughtfully than it was. Moving into Louis' character, I feel like we need to make a distinction between modern day Louis and flashback Louis. Louis. Modern day Louis really annoys me. He's pretentious, he's aggressive, he's angry, he's domineering, he's very pushy in ways that are off-putting and controlling and kind of remind me a little bit of Lestat, which maybe will make more sense in season 2. Maybe we will see why there's like this rush and this need for this book. But if we jump back to the past, episodes 4 and 5 are Louis' parent arc, and I kind of love that for him. It puts him back on like a comfortable footing where he's always had an easy time expressing like family love for a sister or a brother or a mother, or in this case a stand-in daughter, where he hasn't been as comfortable showing love for a partner. So it was really nice to see that softer side of Louis that we got a little taste of in episode 1 and haven't seen as much of. And it was also very interesting to see how tolerant he was of Claudia's violence versus Lestat's violence. I don't know if he feels like Lestat is a negative influence and any of Claudia's violence is an extension of that, or if he feels that Claudia is like a child trying to figure out her place and the right mannerisms in the world. Very interesting to contrast this relationship that Louis seems to have with Claudia with his relationship with Lestat, because it does seem like Lestat benefits some from Claudia's coming into the world. Like Louis has sort of gone back into the vampire bubble as Lestat wanted. When they finally get a coffin for Claudia and Lestat goes back to sleeping with Louis, he says that he had missed him. There's like some gentle handholds and some laughter moments going on. Louis seems less likely to have an issue with graphic kills in general, like for the birthday and stuff. He seemed fine with what happened for that. It is equally interesting to see what happens after Claudia leaves and Louis just like turns into a shell of a being barely existing. Louis had an interesting point in episode 4 that I feel like we see play out in episode 5, where he and Claudia are thought speaking to each other and he explains that Lestat can't hear either of their thoughts anymore and he has to rely on their words just like a human. The just like a human part is what interested me, because I know that Louis loves humanity even in this version, and Lestat in this particular version doesn't care about humanity at all. So I wondered if it like rankled him at all. The thing he loves the most, Louis, has this one element that will forever be human compared to like all his other vampire superpowers. But on top of that, thinking about how Lestat has to rely on Louis' words going into episode 5, where Louis just checks out and stops communicating with Lestat entirely. He like only reads newspapers looking for Claudia and is like repeating random phrases and stuff from books he's reading. Lestat will try to talk to him and Louis will give like a non sequitur response. Like, it's just very sad. I can see how that could be really hurtful and frustrating for Lestat, which like at this point in the story, let me remind you, Lestat has been loving and caring mostly, if a little bit controlling. So it is hard to watch. Unfortunately, it culminates in a fight where Lestat ends up brutalizing Louis. I guess we'll talk about that fight and what that means in going forward in episodes 6 and 7. But it was really rough. And because we haven't gotten like a lot of context about vampire relationships versus human relationships, and I only have the context of what would or wouldn't be okay in a human relationship, the fact that the showrunners said this was going to be a romance and that like Lestat and Louis were probably going to end up being like the canon relationship, I don't know what to do with those two things. And I'm gonna need like more contextualizing, more something to make that happen. And I guess spoilers, I don't see that in 6 and 7, but we will talk about it then. And speaking about Lestat, the first thing that struck me is that Lestat didn't want to make Claudia. That's something he did because Louis begged him, which is a huge change from the book, and it makes some of his threats to like destroy Claudia way more creditable to me. It also kind of like sets Lestat up to be jealous and resentful of Claudia, but even with all of that reason to hate her, there's something precocious and energetic about her that he can't help but admire and enjoy and sort of want to like cultivate within her. And it's especially interesting because it seems like Louis and Claudia for Lestat can be a bit of a balancing act too. He loves Louis and sees him as an eternal companion, but the guy's kind of deficient when it comes to doing some of the vampire-y things that Lestat wants to do. So he really takes Claudia on and like teaches her more about hunting. The two of them kind of like go out together to satisfy those vampire needs. And like between the two of them, it feels like he has a perfect balance. It's also a little bit interesting to me when Louis decides to intervene between Lestat and Claudia's dynamic. And I think he intervened at a bad point. Like when Lestat explains that he can't bring Claudia's lover back because he's dead and makes her burn him and makes her watch the burning. I think if Louis had let Lestat continue through with that kind of blunt form of teaching, even though it was traumatic in that one moment, like the continued guidance and teaching and hard hand might have even been necessary to like control that bloodlust that young vampires have, because we heard all about the little drink and how hard it is to do and how Louis wouldn't be able to do it for years and years and years. And I think maybe Louis thought this was going to be a chance to get Claudia to join him in eating animals, but instead it just like drives her to be crazy and act like a teenage drama queen, like acting out her hurt and self-harming in the most intense way she can. It was striking to me because I see these glimmers in Lestat in Interview with the Vampire, the book, where I think he is trying to be kind and Louis is intentionally or unintentionally misunderstanding what he's saying or how he's saying it. I felt like that was a moment here in this TV show too, where yes, Lestat was doing it cruelly. Yes, he was being a little bit self-centered and thoughtless, but he was also genuinely trying to give Claudia information and like help her move past this in the ways that he knows how. I guess to a certain degree, all the way up until Lestat decides to brutalize Louis, I feel a little bit bad for him because he is dealing with the loss of Claudia, he's dealing with the complete loss of Louis, and he's just looking for someone else, anyone else to kind of like talk to or hang out with. I guess maybe it would have been better if he'd like refocused his efforts in and taken care of Louis, but I don't know that anything could have snapped Louis out of that. So let's talk about a couple thematic elements. First is going to be how homophobia is explored within these two episodes. I think it's really sort of sweet and cute the way that Claudia asks how love between two men works, and Louis says that it's just love. Like, this is such a nice, soft, tender side of him, and it's wonderful to see him like opening up about his sexuality, accepting it in himself, as well as sort of accepting his relationship with Lestat, at least as far as Claudia can tell, because this part is told from her perspective. It re-justifies the whole like vampire bubble, your race, your sexuality, all that stuff doesn't matter as long as you keep it in the vampire bubble. It's a little bit jarring when they go back to dealing with Louis' biological family. The sister and husband see the daughter and ask if like that's morally okay, and they imply it's because Louis and Lestat are lovers together. I read it as the sister having an issue specifically with Louis and Lestat being gay, particularly them having a relationship and raising a child into it, like that conservative talking point. But I think for Louis, he has always sort of like twine together his vampirism and his sexuality, and I think he has a hard time parsing what elements are prejudice against who he loves and what elements could potentially be prejudice of fear of what he is. And I think the show does an interesting job of like tying it up to like maybe the fact that Louis struggles against his vampirism, who he is, what he has to kill, is partially tied up in him struggling with his sexuality and him dealing with like who he loves and how that's part of him too. I mean, the two are very different, obviously. Like, who you love hurts no one. Whether he eats animals or people, like he'll literally be killing people if he chooses the latter. But you can see how the two get tied up in his head, because when the sister brings up, do you think you should have a kid? That's when he references destroying the home's door. So like to him, it's about being a vampire. This episode also introduces sexual assault, rape, and domestic violence as ongoing themes for the rest of the season. I didn't like it, like none of it. I think I already talked about how I didn't feel Claudia's rape was necessary, or that like the fallout from it was handled in any kind of meaningful way. I stand by that. I really don't know why we incorporated that. Like, vampires have a lot of violent, graphic stuff going on with them. Anne Rice's vampires before this TV show were historically sexless, unable to have sex. And to like kind of add that element in specifically to add all the negativity of potential like sex crimes and stuff kind of sucks. I don't even know what to think about the knockdown drag out brawl between Louis and Lestat. There were hints of like manipulation and emotional blackmail and like some crappy things going on in their relationship before. But for Lestat to like hear that Louis might leave him and to respond by beating him so badly he can't go anywhere for months and months and months is really intense. I don't think it would be a problem for me if the showrunners hadn't stated that this was supposed to be a romantic relationship highlighting romance. But unfortunately, they did say that the Louis and Lestat relationship was supposed to be kinder and gentler and was supposed to be shown in like an actual relationship, romantic kind of way. So that like just doesn't compute with what I've been seeing on screen or how it's been handled thus far. And I guess lastly is the racism theme. There's a lot less racism here in 4 and 5 than there has been in the show so far. Perhaps Lestat was correct. Like if Louis goes into the vampire bubble, then there's no more racism. But there is one specific time where Claudia experiences racism, and it's the second she steps out of the vampire bubble and wants to like dress up and like find her boyfriend. That's when like there are the girls on the street kind of like laughing at her and sort of saying some racially charged things in her direction. I do think all of this is helping us build that, like, what is the vampire question, into saying, like, the vampire is supposed to be, like, a metaphor for outsiders, or, like, the vampire is a metaphor for self-acceptance, including the violent, awful parts of you as displayed through the killing, or just the things that are outside of societal norms but are perfectly fine, like sexuality or a race that you might happen to be. I don't know what that says thematically going forward just yet, but it does seem like this is the kind of line this vampire metaphor is walking right now. And that's going to be most of my thoughts for episode 4 and 5. I love these two episodes all the way up until the end of episode 5. Episode 4 is a wonderful, wonderful experience. It's a huge tonal shift that I feel like the series needed. Episode 5, I'm less in love with it, but I enjoy it for the full circle arc of Claudia's character. But talk to me in those comments down below. What did you think of episodes 4 and 5 of Interview with the Vampires, the TV show? And if you got this far into the video and you don't have anything else to say, leave me a moon emoji. And as always, keep reading. Bye!